Overview of biologically based trait theory. Biography of Hans J. Eysenck. Eysenck's factor theory criteria for identifying factors' hierarchy of behavior organization. Dimensions of personality. Extroversion, neuroticism, psychoticism. Measuring personality. Biological basis of personality. Personality as a predictor personality and behavior personality and disease. Related research. The biological basis of extroversion, the biological basis of neuroticism. Critique of Eysenck's biologically based theory. Concept of humanity. Key terms and concepts. References. Page 437. Chance and fortuity often play a decisive role in people's lives. One such chance event happened to an 18-year-old German youth who had left his native country as a consequence of Nazi tyranny. He eventually settled in England, where he tried to enroll in the University of London. He was an avid reader, interested in both the arts and the sciences, but his first choice of curriculum was physics. However, a chance event altered the flow of his life and consequently the course of the history of psychology. In order to be accepted into the university, he was required to pass an entrance examination, which he took after a year's study at a commercial college. After passing the exam, he confidently enrolled in the University of London, intending to major in physics. However, he was told that he had taken the wrong subjects in his entrance exam and therefore was not eligible to pursue a physics. Curriculum. Rather than waiting another year to take the right subjects, he asked if there was some scientific subject that he was qualified to pursue. When told he could always take psychology, he asked, "What on earth is psychology?" He had never heard of psychology, although he had some vague idea about psychoanalysis. Could psychology possibly be a science? However, he had little choice but to pursue a degree in psychology, so he promptly entered the university with a major in a discipline about which he knew almost nothing. Years later, the world of psychology would know a great deal about Hans J. Eysenck, probably the most prolific writer in the history of psychology. In his autobiography, Eysenck, 1997b, simply noted that by such chance events is one's fate decided by bureaucratic stupidity, pp. 47-47. Throughout his life, Eysenck battled bureaucratic stupidity and any other type of stupidity he came across. In his autobiography, he described himself as a sanctimonious prig who didn't suffer fools or even ordinarily bright people gladly. Eysenck, 1997b, p. 3131. Every theory of personality discussed so far has downplayed, ignored, or even argued against the biological basis of human personality. Only McCrae and Costa, see chapter 1313, placed even mild emphasis on genetic and biological influences on personality. With Eysenck, that changed. Eysenck developed a factor theory much like McCrae and Costa, but because he fundamentally based his taxonomy in both factor analysis and biology, he derived only 3, rather than 5, dimensions of personality: extroversion/introversion, neuroticism/stability, and psychoticism/superego. We'll discuss these more later in the chapter, but the key for Eysenck was that the individual differences in people's personalities were biological and not merely psychological aspects of personality. That is, genetic differences lead to structural differences in the central nervous system, including brain structures, hormones, and neurotransmitters, and these differences in biology lead to differences along the 3 factors of personality: extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Evidence for the biological basis of personality comes from many different sources, including temperament, behavioral genetics, and brain measure research. First, temperament is the biologically based tendency to behave in particular ways from very early in life. In one study, for example, Janet DiPietro and her colleagues, 1996, showed that fetal activity and fetal heart rate predict temperament differences over the first year of life. In particular, a high heart rate in a 36-week-old fetus foreshadowed less predictable eating and sleeping habits at 3 and 6 months after birth. A high heart rate also predicted a less emotional infant at 6 months after birth. The prenatal environment may play an important role in shaping personality. In fact, the amount of stress the mother experiences during pregnancy may alter the infant's own stress response. That is, infants born to mothers who have experienced an unusual amount of stress during pregnancy tend to have impaired stress function, higher baseline levels of stress hormones, and a faster, stronger, and more pronounced physiological response to stress, all of which persist into childhood. Barbazanges et al., 1996. Clark and Schneider, 1997. Page 438. Secondly, to understand how heredity affects behavior and personality, psychologists turn to the science of behavioral genetics, or the scientific study of the role of heredity in behavior, Fuller and Thompson, 1960. The extent to which a characteristic is influenced by genetics is known as heritability, as we saw in the McCrae and Costa chapter. Researchers use twin adoption studies and gene by environment studies to study heritability. Twin adoption studies research into hereditary influence on twins, both identical and fraternal, who were raised apart, adopted, and who were raised together. A second technique in the study of heritability, gene by environment interaction research, allows researchers to assess how genetic differences interact with environment to produce certain behavior in some people but not in others. Moffitt, Caspi, and Rutter, 2005. Thopper, Langley, and Asherson, 2007. Instead of using twins, family members, and adoptees to vary genetic similarity, gene by environment studies directly measure genetic variation in parts of the genome itself and examine how such variation interacts with different kinds of environments to produce different behaviors. Thirdly, biological aspects of personality are assessed using brain imaging techniques, the two most common forms of which are the electroencephalography, EEG, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Researchers use electroencephalography, EEG, to record the electrical activity of the brain. The procedure involves placing electrodes on a person's scalp. The electrodes, metal discs attached to wires, are usually mounted in a fabric cap that fits snugly over the head. Typically, the person is conducting certain tasks while electrical activity is recorded. EEG is superior to other brain imaging techniques in showing when brain activity occurs. It is not very accurate at indicating precisely where activity occurs. Functional MRI, fMRI, does, however, tell us about brain activity. Images from fMRI tell us where activity in the brain is occurring during particular tasks by tracking blood oxygen use in brain tissue. In this way, researchers can see which areas of the brain are using the most oxygen and presumably are most active during certain tasks. Lagopoulos, 2007. Hans-Jürgen Eysenck was born in Berlin on March 4, 1916, the only child of a theatrical family. His mother was Ruth Werner, a starlet at the time of Eysenck's birth. Ruth Werner later became a German silent film star under the stage name of Helga Molander. Eysenck's father, Anton Eduard Eysenck, was a comedian, singer, and actor. Eysenck, 1991b, recalled, "I saw very little of my parents, who divorced when I was 4, and who had little feeling for me, an emotion I reciprocated." Page 40. P40. Page 439. After his parents' divorce, Eysenck went to live with his maternal grandmother, who had also been in the theater, but whose promising career in opera was cut short by a crippling fall. Eysenck, 1991b, described his grandmother as unselfish, caring, altruistic, and altogether too good for this world. pp 4040. Although his grandmother was a devout Catholic, neither parent was religious, and Eysenck grew up without any formal religious commitment. Gibson, 1981. He also grew up with little parental discipline and few strict controls over his behavior. Neither parent seemed interested in curtailing his actions, and his grandmother had a quite permissive attitude toward him. This benign neglect is exemplified by two incidents. In the first, his father had bought Hans a bicycle and had promised to teach him to ride. He took me to the top of a hill, told me that I had to sit on the saddle and pump the pedals and make the wheels go round. He then went off to release some balloons, leaving me to learn how to ride all by myself. Eysenck, 1997b, p. 1212. In the second incident, an adolescent Eysenck told his grandmother that he was going to buy some cigarettes, expecting her to forbid it. However, his grandmother simply said, "If you like it, do it by all means, pp. 1414. According to Eysenck, environmental experiences such as these two have little to do with personality development. To him, genetic factors have a greater impact on subsequent behavior than do childhood experiences. Thus, his permissive upbringing neither helped nor hindered him in becoming a famous maverick scientist." Even as a schoolboy, Eysenck was not afraid to take an unpopular stand, often challenging his teachers, especially those with militaristic leanings. He was skeptical of much of what they taught, and was not always reluctant to embarrass them with his superior knowledge and intellect. Eysenck suffered the deprivation of many posts. World War I Germans who were facing the condition of studying physics at the University of Berlin, he was told that he would have to join the Nazi secret police, an idea he found so repugnant that he decided to leave Germany. This encounter with the fascist right and his later battles with the radical left suggested to him that the trait of tough-mindedness, or authoritarianism, was equally prevalent in both extremes of the political spectrum. Later, he found some scientific support for this hypothesis in a study that demonstrated that although communists were radical and fascists were conservative on one dimension of personality, on the tough-minded versus tender-minded dimension, both groups were authoritarian, rigid, and intolerant of ambiguity. Tough-minded. Eysenck, 1954. Eysenck and Coulter, 1972. As a consequence of Nazi tyranny, Eysenck, at age 18, left Germany and eventually settled in England, where he tried to enroll in the University of London. As we saw in the chapter opening vignette, he went into psychology completely by accident. At that time, the psychology department at the University of London was basically pro-Freudian, but it also had a strong emphasis on psychometrics, with Charles Spearman having just left and with Cyril Burt still presiding. Eysenck received a bachelor's degree in 1938, about the same time that he married Margaret Davies, a Canadian with a degree in mathematics. In 1940, he was awarded a PhD from the University of London, but by this time England and most European nations were at war. Page 440. As a German national, he was considered an enemy alien and not allowed to enter the Royal Air Force, his first choice, or any other branch of the military. Instead, with no training as a psychiatrist or as a clinical psychologist, he went to work at the Mill Hill Emergency Hospital, treating patients who were suffering from a variety of psychological symptoms, including anxiety, depression, and hysteria. Eysenck, however, was not comfortable with most of the traditional clinical diagnostic categories. Using factor analysis, he found that two major personality factors, neuroticism/emotional stability and extroversion/introversion, could account for all the traditional diagnostic groups. These early theoretical ideas led to the publication of his first book, Dimensions of Personality, Eysenck, 1947. After the war, he became director of the psychology department at Maudsley Hospital and later became a reader in psychology at the University of London. In 1949, he traveled to North America to examine the clinical psychology programs in the United States and Canada with the idea of setting up a clinical psychology profession in Great Britain. He obtained a visiting professorship at the University of Pennsylvania for the year 1949 to 1950, but he spent much of that year traveling throughout the United States and Canada looking over clinical psychology programs which he found to be totally inadequate and unscientific. Eysenck, 1980, 1997b. Eysenck and his wife had been growing steadily apart, and his marriage was not improved when his traveling companion to Philadelphia was Sybil Rostow, a beautiful quantitative psychologist. On returning to England, Eysenck obtained a divorce from his first wife and married Sybil. Hans and Sybil Eysenck co-authored several publications, and their marriage produced 3 sons and a daughter. Eysenck's son from his first marriage, Michael, is a widely published author of psychology articles and books. After returning from North America, Eysenck established a clinical psychology department at the University of London and in 1955 became professor of psychology. While in the United States, he had begun the structure of human personality, 1952b, in which he argued for the efficacy of factor analysis as the best method of representing the known facts of human personality. Eysenck was perhaps the most prolific writer in the history of psychology, having published about 800 journal articles or book chapters and more than 75 books, a feat made all the more remarkable by the claim by Sybil, his second wife, that he was very much a family man and never took work home with him. Eysenck, 2016. Several have titles with popular appeal, such as Uses and Abuses of Psychology, 1953, The Psychology of Politics, 1954, 1999, Sense and Nonsense in Psychology, 1956, Know Your Own IQ, 1962, Fact and Fiction in Psychology, 1965, Psychology is About People, 1972, You and Neurosis, 1977b, Sex, Violence, and the Media, with Dietz K. B. Nias, 1978, Smoking, Personality, and Stress, 1991d, Genius, The Natural History of Creativity, 1995, and Intelligence, A New Look, 1998a. Eysenck's range of interests was exceedingly broad, and his willingness to step into almost any controversy was legendary. He was a gadfly to the conscience of psychology since he first entered its ranks. He upset many psychoanalysts and other therapists in the early 1950s with his contention that no evidence existed to suggest that psychotherapy was more effective than spontaneous remission. In other words, those people who received no therapy were just as likely to get better as were those who underwent expensive, painful, prolonged psychotherapy with expertly trained psychoanalysts and psychologists. Eysenck, 1952a. Eysenck maintained that belief for the remainder of his life. In 1996, he told an interviewer that psychotherapies are no more effective than placebo treatments, Feltham, 1996, 424. P. 424. Page 441. Eysenck was not afraid to take an unpopular stand, as witnessed by his defense of Arthur Jensen, whose contention was that IQ scores cannot be significantly increased by well-intentioned social programs because they are largely genetically determined. Eysenck's book, The IQ. Argument, 1971, was so controversial that elements in the United States threatened booksellers with arson if they dared to stock the book. Well-known liberal newspapers refused to review it, and the outcome was that it was largely impossible in the land of free speech to discover the existence of the book or to buy it. Eysenck, 1980, p. 175175. In fact, after the family home was vandalized by protesters in England, the Eysencks went so far as to change their children's last names for a few years in order to ensure their safety. Eysenck, 2016. In 1983, Eysenck retired as professor of psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry, University of London, and as senior psychiatrist at the Maudsley and Bethlehem Royal Hospitals. He then served as professor emeritus at the University of London until his death from cancer on September 4th, 1997. Eysenck, who frequently argued that cigarette smoking was not a major risk factor for cancer, had been a heavy smoker until middle age when he gave up cigarettes because he believed that they affected his tennis game. During his later years, his research continued to reflect various topics, including creativity, Eysenck, 1993-1995, Freud and Eysenck, 1995, behavioral interventions in cancer and heart disease, Eysenck, 1991d, 1996, Eysenck and gross arithmetic, 1991, and intelligence, Eysenck, 1998a. Eysenck won many awards, including the 1991 Distinguished Contributions Award of the International Society for the Study of Individual Differences. The American Psychological Association presented him with its Distinguished Scientist Award, 1988, the Presidential Citation for Scientific Contribution, 1993, the William James Fellow Award, 1994, and the Centennial Award for Distinguished Contributions to Clinical Psychology, 1996. The personality theory of Hans Eysenck has strong psychometric and biological components. However, Eysenck, 1977a, 1997a, contended that psychometric sophistication alone is not sufficient to measure the structure of human personality, and that personality dimensions arrived at. Through factor analytic methods are sterile and meaningless unless they have been shown to possess a biological existence. Page 442. With these assumptions in mind, Eysenck listed 4 criteria for identifying a factor. First, psychometric evidence for the factor's existence must be established. A corollary to this criterion is that the factor must be reliable and replicable. Other investigators from separate laboratories must also be able to find the factor, and these investigators consistently identify Eysenck's extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. A second criterion is that the factor must also possess heritability and must fit an established genetic model. This criterion eliminates learned characteristics, such as the ability to mimic the voices of well-known people or a religious or political belief. Third, the factor must make sense from a theoretical view. Eysenck employed the deductive method of investigation, beginning with a theory and then gathering data that are logically consistent with that theory. The final criterion for the existence of a factor is that it must possess social relevance. That is, it must be demonstrated that mathematically derived factors have a relationship, not necessarily causal, with such socially relevant variables as drug addiction, proneness to unintentional injuries, outstanding performance in sports, psychotic behavior, criminality, and so on. Eysenck, 1947-1994c, recognized a 4-level hierarchy of behavior organization. At the lowest level are specific acts or cognitions, individual behaviors or thoughts that may or may not be characteristic of a person. A student finishing a reading assignment would be an example of a specific response. At the second level are the habitual acts or cognitions, that is, responses that recur under similar conditions. For example, if a student frequently keeps at an assignment until it is finished, this behavior becomes a habitual response. As opposed to specific responses, habitual responses must be reasonably reliable or consistent. Several related habitual responses form a trait, the third level of behavior. Eysenck, 1981, defined traits as important semi-permanent personality dispositions, pp. 33. For example, students would have the trait of persistence if they habitually complete class assignments and keep working at other endeavors until they are finished. Although traits can be identified intuitively, trait and factor theorists rely on a more systematic approach, namely factor analysis. Trait-level behaviors are extracted through factor analysis of habit-level responses, just as habitual responses are mathematically extracted through factor analysis of specific responses. Traits, then, are defined in terms of significant intercorrelations between different habitual behaviors. Eysenck, 1990, p. 244. Most of Catel's 35 normal and abnormal primary source traits are At this third level of organization, which accounts for the fact that he identified far more personality dimensions than either Eysenck or advocates of the five-factor theory, see chapter 1313. Eysenck concentrated on the fourth level, that Ofti-Pieser superfactors. A type is made up of several interrelated traits. For example, persistence may be related to inferiority, poor emotional adjustment, social shyness, and several other traits, with the entire cluster forming the introverted type. Each of the four levels of behavior organization are shown in figure 14.114.1. Page 443. Figure 14.1 the organization of behavior into specific actions, habitual responses, traits, and types. Besides persistence and social shyness, other traits such as inferiority, low activity, and serious-mindedness contribute to introversion. We have seen that Eysenck and Cattell arrived at a different number of personality dimensions because they worked at different levels of factoring. Cattell's 35 traits are all at the third level of the hierarchical structure, whereas Eysenck's superfactors are at the fourth level. See page 384, chapter 13. Chapter 13. How many general superfactors exist? Many current factor theorists insist that ample evidence exists that 5, and no more and no fewer, general factors will emerge from nearly all factor analyses of personality traits. Eysenck, however, extracted only 3 general superfactors. His 3 personality dimensions are extroversion, E, neuroticism, N, and psychoticism, P, although he did not rule out the possibility that further dimensions may be added later. Eysenck, 1994b. P 151151. Figure 14.2 shows the hierarchical structure of Eysenck's P, E, and N. Page 444. Figure 14.2 the hierarchical structure of P, psychoticism, E, extroversion introversion, and N, neuroticism. Source, Eysenck, H.J., Biological Dimensions of Personality. In L. A. Pervin ed. Handbook of Personality, Theory and Research. New York, Guilford Press, 1990, pages 224,224 to 276.276. Neuroticism and psychoticism are not limited to pathological individuals, although disturbed people tend to score higher than normal. People on scales measuring these 2 factors. Eysenck regarded all 3 factors as part of normal personality structure. All 3 are bipolar, with extroversion being at one end of factor E and introversion occupying the opposite pole. Similarly, factor N includes neuroticism at one pole and stability at the other, and factor P has psychoticism at one pole and thesiporigo function at the other. The bipolarity of Eysenck's factors does not imply that most people are at one end or the other of the 3 main poles. Each factor is unimodally, rather than bimodally distributed. Page 445. Extroversion, for example, is fairly normally distributed in much the same fashion as intelligence or height. That is, most people are near the center of a bell-shaped distribution of extroversion. Eysenck contended that each of these factors meets his 4 criteria for identifying personality dimensions. First, strong psychometric evidence exists for each, especially factors E and N. The P factor, psychoticism, emerged later in Eysenck's work, but was not taken seriously by other researchers until the mid-1990s. Eysenck, 1997b. Extroversion and neuroticism, or anxiety, are basic factors in nearly all factor analytic studies of human personality, including various versions of the 5-factor theory, McRae and Costa, 1999, 2002, John and Shrivastava, 1999. Second, Eysenck, 1994a, 1994b, argued that a strong biological base exists for each of his three superfactors. At the same time, he claimed that traits such as agreeableness and conscientiousness, which are part of the five-factor taxonomy, John 1990, W. T. Norman 1963, Tupps and Crystal 1961, do not have an underlying biological foundation. Third, Eysenck's three personality dimensions make sense theoretically. Carl Jung, see Chapter 44, and others have recognized the powerful effect on behavior of extroversion and introversion. Factor E and Sigmund Freud, see Chapter 22, emphasize the importance of anxiety, Factor N, on shaping behavior. In addition, psychoticism, Factor P, agrees with theorists such as Abraham Maslow, see Chapter 99, who propose that psychological health ranges from self-actualization, a low P score, to schizophrenia and psychosis, a high P score. Fourth, Eysenck repeatedly demonstrated that his three factors relate to such social issues as drug use. Eysenck, 1983, Sexual Behaviors. Eysenck, 1976, Criminality. Eysenck, 1964, 1998b. Eysenck and Gudjonson, 1989, Preventing Cancer and Heart Disease. Eysenck, 1991c, 1991d. Grossarth-Matisek, Eysenck and Vetter, 1988, and Creativity. Eysenck, 1993. In Chapter 44, we explained that Jung conceptualized two broad personality types called extroversion and introversion. We also noted some differences between his definitions and the prevailing notion of these two terms. Jung saw extrovert people as having an objective or non-personalized view of the world, whereas introverts have essentially a subjective or individualized way of looking at things. Eysenck's concepts of extroversion and introversion are closer to the popular usage. Extroverts are characterized primarily by sociability and impulsiveness, but also by jocularity, liveliness, quick-wittedness, optimism, and other traits indicative of people who are rewarded for their association with others. Eysenck and Eysenck, 1969. Introverts are characterized by traits opposite those of extroverts. They can be described as quiet, passive, unsociable, careful, reserved, thoughtful, pessimistic, peaceful, sober, and controlled. According to Eysenck, 1982, however, the principal differences between extroversion and introversion are not behavioral, but rather biological and genetic in nature. Eysenck, 1982, 1997a, believed that the primary cause of differences between extroverts and introverts is one of cortical arousal level, a physiological condition that is largely inherited rather than learned. Because extroverts have a lower level of cortical arousal than do introverts, they have higher sensory thresholds and thus lesser reactions to sensory stimulation. Introverts, conversely, are characterized by a higher level of arousal, and as a result of a lower sensory threshold, they experience greater reactions to sensory stimulation. To maintain an optimal level of stimulation, introverts, with their congenitally low sensory threshold, avoid situations that will cause too much excitement. Hence, introverts shun such activities as wild social events, downhill skiing, skydiving, competitive sports, leading a fraternity. Page 446. Or sorority, or playing practical jokes. Conversely, because extroverts have a habitually low level of cortical arousal, they need a high level of sensory stimulation to maintain an optimal level of stimulation. Therefore, extroverts participate more often in exciting and stimulating activities. They may enjoy such activities as mountain climbing, gambling, driving fast cars, drinking alcohol, and smoking marijuana. In addition, Eysenck, 1976, hypothesized that extroverts, as opposed to introverts, will engage in sexual intercourse earlier, more frequently, with a wider range of partners, in a greater number of positions, with a larger variety of sexual behaviors, and will indulge in longer precoital love play. Because extroverts have a lower level of cortical arousal, however, they become more quickly accustomed to strong stimuli, sexual or otherwise, and respond less and less to the same stimuli, whereas introverts are less likely to become bored and uninterested in routine activities carried on with the same people. In short, Eysenck was arguing that people seek out, prefer, and perform best in environments that match their natural arousal levels. Introverts seek out and perform best in quiet environments with relatively low levels of stimulation and arousal, whereas extroverts do the same in louder environments with relatively high levels of stimulation and arousal. In figure 14.314.3, we see a version of a figure drawn by Eysenck to depict this relationship. Hedonic tone refers to the subjective feeling of the person in the situation, either positive or negative. Figure 14.3, the relationship between arousal levels, introversion, extroversion, and performing and feeling best, hedonic tone. Extroverts perform best in relatively high levels of arousal and introverts in relatively low levels of arousal. Adapted from Eysenck, 1982, p. 1717. Page 447. The second superfactor extracted by Eysenck is neuroticism/stability, N. Like extroversion/introversion, factor N has a strong hereditary component. Eysenck, 1967, reported several studies that have found evidence of a genetic basis for such neurotic traits as anxiety, hysteria, and obsessive-compulsive disorders. In addition, he found a much greater agreement among identical twins than among fraternal twins on a number of antisocial and asocial behaviors such as adult crime, childhood behavior disorders, homosexuality, and alcoholism. Eysenck, 1964. People who score high on neuroticism often have a tendency to overreact emotionally and have difficulty returning to a normal state after emotional arousal. They frequently complain of physical symptoms such as headache and backache, and of vague psychological problems such as worries and anxieties. Eysenck, 1967-1982, proposed this emotional reactivity in neuroticism is due to having a highly reactive limbic system, including the amygdala and hypothalamus. Neuroticism, however, does not necessarily suggest a neurosis in the traditional meaning of that term. People can score high on neuroticism and be free of any debilitating psychological symptoms. Eysenck accepted the diathesis stress model of psychiatric illness, which suggests that some people are vulnerable to illness because they have either a genetic or an acquired weakness that predisposes them to an illness. This predisposition, diathesis, may interact with stress to produce a neurotic disorder. Eysenck assumed that people at the healthy end of the N scale have the capacity to resist a neurotic disorder even in periods of extreme stress. High-end scorers, however, may suffer a neurotic reaction as a result of only a minimal level of stress. In other words, the higher the neuroticism score, the lower the level of stress necessary to precipitate a neurotic disorder. Because neuroticism can be combined with different points on the extroversion scale, no single syndrome can define neurotic behavior. Eysenck's factor analytic technique assumes the independence of factors, which means that the neuroticism scale is at right angles, signifying zero correlation, to the extroversion scale. Thus, several people can all score high on the N scale, yet display quite different symptoms, depending on their degree of introversion or extroversion. Figure 14.4 shows the extroversion/introversion pole with zero correlation with the neuroticism/stability pole. Consider persons A, B, and C, all equally high on the neuroticism scale, but representing three distinct points on the extroversion scale. Person A, an introverted neurotic, is characterized by anxiety, depression, phobias, and obsessive-compulsive symptoms. Person B, who is high on neuroticism but only average on extroversion, is likely to be characterized by hysteria. A. Neurotic disorder associated with emotional instability, suggestibility, and somatic symptoms, and person C, an extrovert neurotic individual, will probably manifest psychopathic qualities such as criminality and delinquent tendencies. Eysenck, 1967, 1997a. Consider, also, persons A, D, and E, all equally introverted, but with three different levels of emotional stability. Person A is the introverted neurotic individual we just described. Person D is equally introverted, but is neither severely neurotic nor emotionally stable, and Person E is both extremely introverted and psychologically stable. Figure 14.4 shows only 5 people, all of whom have at least one extreme score. Most people, of course, would score near the mean on both extroversion and neuroticism. As scores move toward the outer limits of the diagram, they become increasingly less frequent, just as scores on the ends of a bell-shaped curve are less frequent than those near the midpoint. Page 448. Figure 14.4 two-dimensional scheme depicting several extreme points on Eysenck's E and N scales. Eysenck's original theory of personality was based on only 2 personality dimensions, extroversion and neuroticism. After several years of alluding to psychoticism, P, as an independent personality factor, Eysenck finally elevated it to a position equal to E and N, Eysenck and Eysenck, 1976. Like extroversion and neuroticism, P is a bipolar factor, with psychoticism on one pole and superego on the other. High P scorers are often egocentric, cold, nonconforming, impulsive, hostile, aggressive, suspicious, psychopathic, and antisocial. People low on psychoticism, in the direction of superego function, tend to be altruistic, highly socialized, empathic, caring, cooperative, conforming, and conventional. Eysenck, 1997. Earlier, we saw that Eysenck accepted the diathesis stress model for people high on the neuroticism scale, that is, stress and high-end scores combine to elevate people's vulnerability to psychological disorders. This model also suggests that people who score high on psychoticism and who are also experiencing levels of stress have an increased chance of developing a psychotic disorder. Eysenck, 1994, hypothesized that people high on psychoticism have a high predisposition to succumb to stress and develop a psychotic illness. PP 2020. This diathesis stress model suggests that high P scorers are genetically more vulnerable to stress than are low P scorers. During periods of little stress, high P scorers may function normally, but when high psychoticism interacts with high levels of stress, people become vulnerable to psychotic disorders. By contrast, people with low P scores are not necessarily vulnerable to stress-related psychoses and will resist a psychotic break even in periods of extreme stress. According to Eysenck, 1994A, 1994B, the higher the psychoticism score, the lower the level of stress necessary to precipitate a psychotic reaction. Page 449. Psychoticism/superego, P, is independent of both E and N. Figure 14.5 shows each of the 3 factors at right angles with the other 2, because 3-dimensional space cannot be faithfully produced on a 2-dimensional plane. The reader is asked to look at figure 14.5 as if the solid lines represent the corner of a room where 2 walls meet the floor. Each line can then be seen as perpendicular to the other 2. Eysenck's view of personality, therefore, allows each person to be measured on 3 independent factors and resultant scores to be plotted in space having 3 coordinates. Person F in figure 14.5, for example, is quite high on superego, somewhat high on extroversion, and near the midpoint on the neuroticism/stability scale. In similar fashion, scores of each person can be plotted in 3-dimensional space. Figure 14.5 3-dimensional scheme depicting one individual's scores on each of Eysenck's major dimensions of personality. Eysenck evolved 4 personality inventories that measure his superfactors. The first, the Maudsley Personality Inventory, or MPI, Eysenck, 1959, assessed only E and N and yielded some correlation between these 2 factors. For this reason, Eysenck developed another test, the Eysenck Personality Inventory, or EPI. The EPI contains a lie, L, scale to detect faking, but more importantly, it measures extroversion and neuroticism independently, with a near-zero correlation between E and N, H, J, Eysenck and B, G, Eysenck, 1964, 1968. The Eysenck Personality Inventory was extended to children 7 to 16 years of age by Sybil G. Eysenck, 1965, who developed the Junior EPI. Page 450. The EPI was still a two-factor inventory, so consequently Hans Eysenck and Sybil Eysenck, 1975, published a third personality test, namely the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire, EPQ, which included a psychoticism, P scale. The EPQ, which has both an adult version and a junior version, is a revision of the still published EPI. Subsequent criticisms of the P scale led to yet another revision, the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire revised, H. J. Eysenck and S. B. G. Eysenck, 1993. According to Eysenck, personality factors P, E, and N all have powerful biological determinants. He estimated that about 3/4 of the variance of all three personality dimensions can be accounted for by heredity and about 1/4 by environmental factors. Eysenck, 1990, cited three threads of evidence for a strong biological component in personality. First, researchers McCrae and Alec, 2002, have found nearly identical factors among people in various parts of the world, not only in Western Europe and North America, but also in Uganda, Nigeria, Japan, China, Russia, and other African and European countries. Second, evidence, McCrae and Costa, 2003, suggests that individuals tend to maintain their position over time on the different dimensions of personality. And third, studies of twins, Eysenck, 1990, show a higher concordance between identical twins than between same-gender fraternal twins reared together, suggesting that genetic factors play a dominant part in determining individual differences in personality. In Eysenck's theory of personality, psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism have both antecedents and consequences. The antecedents are genetic and biological, whereas the consequences include such experimental variables as conditioning experiences, sensitivity, and memory, as well as social behaviors such as criminality, creativity, psychopathology, and sexual behavior. Figure 14.6 shows that P, E, and N are in the middle of a 5-step progression from DNA to social behavior, with biological intermediaries and experimental evidence anchoring the three major personality dimensions. In other words, personality has genetic determinants that indirectly shape biological intermediaries, and these biological intermediaries help mold P, E, and N. In turn, P, E, and N contribute to a wide variety of laboratory learnings as well as social behaviors. Figure 14.6, a model of the major components of Eysenck's theory of personality. Eysenck's complex model of personality shown in figure 14.6 suggests that the psychometric traits of P, E, and N can combine with one another and with genetic determinants, biological intermediates, and experimental studies to predict a variety of social behaviors, including those that contribute to disease. Do Eysenck's three general personality dimensions predict behavior? According to Eysenck's model shown in figure 14.614.6, psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism should predict results of experimental studies as well as social behaviors. Recall that Eysenck's theory assumes that extroversion is a product of low cortical arousability. Therefore, introverts, compared with extroverts, should be more sensitive to a variety of stimuli and learning conditions. Eysenck, 1997a, argued that an effective theory of personality should predict both proximal and distal consequences, see figure 14.614.6, and he and his son Michael, H.J., Eysenck and M. W. Eysenck, 1985, cited studies that demonstrated extroverts' greater demand for change and novelty in both laboratory studies and studies of social behavior. Eysenck, 1997a, further argued that many psychology studies have reached erroneous conclusions because they have ignored personality factors. For example, studies in education comparing the effectiveness of discovery learning and traditional reception learning have often produced either conflicting differences or no differences. Eysenck believed that these studies did not consider that extrovert children prefer and do better with the more active discovery learning, whereas introverted children prefer and do better with the more passive reception learning. In other words, an interaction exists between personality dimensions and learning styles. However, when investigators ignore these personality factors, they may find no differences in the comparative effectiveness of discovery versus reception learning styles. Eysenck, 1995, also hypothesized that psychoticism, P, is related to genius and creativity. Again, the relationship is not simple. Many children have creative ability, are non-conforming, and have unorthodox ideas, but they grow up to be non-creative people. Eysenck found evidence that these people lack the persistence of high P scores. Children with the same creative potential who are also high in psychoticism, P, are able to resist the criticisms of parents and teachers and to emerge as creative adults. Similarly, Eysenck and S. B. G. Eysenck, 1975, reported that both high P scorers and high E scorers are likely to be troublemakers as children. However, parents and teachers tend to regard the extrovert children as charming rogues and to forgive their misdemeanors, whereas they see high P scorers as more spiteful, disruptive, and unlovable. Thus, the high E scoring troublemakers tend to grow into productive adults, while the high P scoring troublemakers tend to continue to have learning problems, to get into crime, and to have difficulty making friends. S. Eysenck, 1997. Again, Eysenck believes strongly that psychologists can be led astray if they do not consider the various combinations of personality dimensions in conducting their research. Page 452. 10 personality factors predict mortality from cancer and cardiovascular disease, CVD. Beginning during the early 1960s, Eysenck devoted much attention to this question. He and David Kissin and Eysenck, 1962, found that people who scored low on neuroticism and on the Maudsley Personality Inventory tended to suppress their emotion and were much more likely than high-end scorers to receive a later diagnosis of lung cancer. Later, Eysenck teamed with Yugoslav physician and psychologist Ronald Grossarth-Matysek. Eysenck and Grossarth-Matysek, 1991. Grossarth-Matic and Eysenck, 1989. Grossarth-Matysek, Eysenck, and Vetter, 1988, to investigate not only the relationship between personality and disease, but also the effectiveness of behavior therapy on prolonging the life of cancer and CVD patients. Grossarth-Matysek had used a short questionnaire and a long personal interview to place people into one of 4 groups or types. Type I included people with a hopeless/helpless. Non-emotional reaction to stress. Type 2 people typically reacted to frustration with anger, aggression, and emotional arousal. Type 3 people were ambivalent, shifting from the typical reaction of Type I people to the typical reaction of Type 2s, and then back again. Type 4 individuals regarded their own autonomy as an important condition to their personal well-being and happiness. In the original study in Yugoslavia, Type I people were much more likely than others to die of cancer, and Type 2 people were much more likely to die of heart disease. Type 3 and Type 4 individuals had very low death rates from either cancer or CVD. Grossarth-Matysek, Eysenck, and Vetter replicated this study in Heidelberg, Germany, and found very similar results. As Eysenck, 1996, pointed out, these and other studies on the relationship between personality and disease do not prove that psychological factors cause cancer and heart disease. Rather, these diseases are caused by an interaction of many factors. For cardiovascular disease, these factors include family history, age, gender, ethnic background, hypertension, unfavorable ratio of total cholesterol to high-density lipoprotein, HDL, smoking, diet, inactive lifestyle, and several personality factors. For cancer, The risks include smoking, diet, alcohol, sexual practices, family history, ethnic background, and personality factors. Brannan, Updegraff, and Feist, 2018. Eysenck, 1996, contended that cigarette smoking alone does not cause cancer or CVD, but when it is combined with stress and personality factors, it helps contribute to death from these two diseases. For example, Eysenck and his associates, Maruzic, Gudjonson, Eysenck, and Stark, 1999, developed a complex biopsychosocial model for heart disease that included 11 biological and 7 psychosocial factors. Their research with men in the Republic of Slovenia supported the hypothesis that personality factors interact with a variety of biological factors to contribute to heart disease. One such interaction was for smoking, neuroticism, and emotional reactivity, that is, high P scorers who smoke and who react to stress with anger, hostility, and aggression increase their risk for heart disease. Page 453. Eysenck developed the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire, EPQ, and its offshoots, Eysenck, 1959, Eysenck and Eysenck, 1964, 1968, 1975, 1993. The EPQ has been used in conjunction with neurophysiological and genetic measures to assess the biological basis of personality. One of the major thrusts of Eysenck's theory is that personality dimensions are not arbitrary creations of culture, but rather result from the basic genetic and neurophysiological makeup of the human species. If there were a biological basis to personality, 2 key assumptions should hold true. First, neurophysiological differences should exist between people high on one end of a dimension, for instance, introversion, and those high on the other end of that dimension, for instance, extroverts. Second, the basic personality dimensions should be universal and not limited to a given culture. The first domain to test Eysenck's biological model of personality is in neurophysiology. If, as Eysenck proposed, introverts have lower thresholds of arousal than do extroverts, then they should be more reactive, i.e., sensitive, to sensory stimulation. One way to test this idea is to present both groups with varying intensities of stimulation and measure their physiological reactivity. If Eysenck's theory is to be supported, then introverts should be more reactive than extroverts. A technical point is important here. Cortical arousal level has mostly been measured by EEG, electrical activity, via the scalp. There are 2 main levels of cortical activity while awake, known as alpha and beta, respectively. Alpha is the lowest level, 8 to 13 Hz, of arousal, and beta is the next strongest, 14 to 35 Hz. Alpha is traditionally associated with drowsiness and relaxation, and beta with alertness and wakefulness. Many researchers have followed Eysenck's lead and used alpha as a measure of cortical arousal, whereas other researchers argue that beta is a better measure of cognitive activity and arousal. Kussner et al., 2016, Ray and Cole, 1985. Over the past 30 years, a substantial amount of research has explored cognitive, behavioral, and physiological measures of reactivity in relation to extroversion-introversion. Budisell, Brock, and Louis, 2006. Kussner, De Groot, Hoffman, and Hillen, 2016. Mitchell and Kumari, 2016. Stelmach, 1990, 1997. In general, Eysenck's assumption that introverts are more reactive, have lower thresholds than extroverts has been supported, with the qualification that it is reactivity rather than baseline activity levels that distinguishes introverts from extroverts. Mitchell and Kumari, 2016. For instance, in a recent study, Budisell and colleagues, 2006, predicted that extroverts would be less cortically aroused and show worse performance on a boring and monotonous task. The researchers selected students who scored either very low or very high on the Eysenck Personality Questionnaire, extroversion scale, They then presented the participants with a series of tones every 3 seconds for 60 minutes. Participants had to press a button as soon as possible after they heard a target tone. Computers measured both the speed, reaction time, and accuracy of responses. The task was meant to be tedious and boring, and the idea is that extroverts will do worse at the tone task because it is so understimulating. Finally, the participants' cortical activity was measured via EEG throughout the entire tone task. The predictions again were that extroverts would have lower cortical arousal and would do worse on the monotonous task. Budisell and colleagues found support for both of these hypotheses, which support two of the most basic of Eysenck's assumptions about the biological basis of personality traits. Page 454. Optimal level of arousal is another of Eysenck's hypotheses that has generated some research. Eysenck theorized that introverts should work best in environments of relatively low sensory stimulation, whereas extroverts should perform best under conditions of relatively high sensory stimulation. Dornick and Eckhammer, 1990. One test of Eysenck's theory was carried out by Dobbs and colleagues, 2011, who assessed personality and cognitive task performance under 3 sound conditions: silence, noise, and music. Based on Eysenck, they predicted that extroverts would perform better than introverts on the noise and music conditions, but not on the silence condition. Dobbs et al. Measured levels of introversion and extroversion using a self-report questionnaire, Eysenck Personality Inventory, EPI. They manipulated sound conditions in the following way. Noise was 12 minutes of everyday sounds such as children playing, an office. Atmosphere and laughs. Music was 13 minutes of current pop vocal music, and silence played no sounds. Various cognitive intelligence test measures were administered to assess cognitive performance. One of these was the nonverbal measure of intelligence, known as the Raven's Progressive Matrices test, in which there is a series of geometric figures making up a pattern and a missing piece. The task is to figure out the underlying pattern in the shapes and to choose the missing piece based on one's idea of the pattern. Another cognitive intelligence measure was the Wunderlich Personnel test, which has word, number, sentence, and geometric figure problems of varying levels of difficulty. Finally, a less complex cognitive task was also administered, namely the verbal reasoning test, which consisted of identifying antonyms, sentence completion, and choosing grammatically correct sentences. Participants were 118 middle and high school girls in the United Kingdom. Preferring to be alone at times is one way that introverted people regulate their optimal level of arousal. Image source /Getty Images. Results of the study, in general, supported the predictions and Eysenck's theory. Extroverts performed better than introverts on the cognitive tasks in the noise and music conditions, but not the silence. Condition. For example, on the Raven's Progressive Matrix test, introverted students were distracted in the noise and music conditions, whereas the extrovert students were not affected by either the noise or the music. See figure 14.714.7. We should point out that this pattern did not hold on a less demanding cognitive task, verbal reasoning, and therefore how complex the cognitive task seems to matter. A second source of support for Eysenck's biologically based theory of personality comes from behavioral genetics. Behavioral genetic research is often based on the study of twins, both identical and fraternal, who have been raised together or apart. Twin studies have found that most basic personality traits have heritability estimates of between 40% and 60%, Plowman and Caspi, 1999. In other words, an individual's genetic makeup goes about halfway toward explaining his or her basic traits. For instance, the trait of extroversion or outgoingness often correlates around 0.50 for identical twins and around 0.20 to 0.25 for fraternal twins, which leads to a heritability estimate of between 50% and 60%. Likewise, between 50% and 55% of the difference in eroticism is due to genetics. Bouchard and Lolin, 2001. Caspi, Roberts, and Shiner, 2005. Kruger and Johnson, 2008. Plowman and Caspi, 1999. Moreover, other researchers have begun to uncover specific genes. Locations involved in producing neurotransmitters, such as serotonin, that are connected to traits of extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Gillespie et al., 2008. Figure 14.7 Raven's progressive matrix scores as a function of extroversion and sound conditions. Source: Dobbs et al., 2011. Reprinted with permission from Wiley & Sons, Inc. In summary, research tends to support Eysenck's notion that personality factors have a biological basis and are not simply dependent on what we have learned. Indeed, consistent with the biological basis of personality, the major traits appear to be consistent in most countries of the world. McCrae, 2002, Portinga, Van de Vigver, and Van Hemert, 2002. How and when personality traits are expressed is clearly influenced by our cultural and social context, but that we all can be described on similar dimensions of personality, e.g., extroversion or neuroticism, is influenced by our biological makeup. Personality, in short, is molded by both nature and nurture. Recall that Eysenck, 1967, postulated that neuroticism resulted from increased activity or responsiveness and lower activation thresholds in the limbic system. This pattern is the same as introversion, but the location is different. Introversion involves increased activity and lower thresholds for cortical and reticular arousal rather than limbic system arousal. The limbic system is comprised of the subcortical structures in the brain involved in emotion and motivation, primarily the amygdala and hypothalamus. Therefore, researchers have explored Eysenck's hypothesis that differences in limbic system activity and physiology are the basis for neuroticism, the disposition to experience negative emotions such as stress, anxiety, guilt, and depression. In general, there is quite a bit of empirical evidence supporting this theory. Mitchell and Kamari, 2016. For instance, Eysenck, 2015, conducted a meta-analysis on the topic of neuroticism and the structure and function of the amygdala. Meta-analyses are the process of collecting all of the published and even as much unpublished literature as one can find on one specific topic or question, and calculating the overall size of the effect on the question at hand. It is a quantitative review of the literature and tells us how large of an effect there is across all studies rather than just one. Eysenck collected and analyzed 13 quantitative studies on brain structure and function and neuroticism. Across these 13 studies, there was consistent evidence for more gray matter cell bodies in the amygdala of people high in neuroticism compared to those who are low in neuroticism. More gray matter is consistent with increased activity or responsiveness of the amygdala. To be fair, this association is not true for each amygdala. Like all subcortical structures, the amygdala comes in twos, one in the right hemisphere and one in the left. Increased amygdala activity is found more in the left than right amygdala. Eysenck, 2015. Other research suggests that there are reduced neural connections between the amygdala and other brain regions involved in controlling thoughts. This lack of connection appears to inhibit the off switch in the amygdala, resulting in its overactivity to negative experiences. Canley, 2008. Ormel et al., 2012. In short, people high in neuroticism are biased toward and more sensitive to negative emotional experiences, partly due to an overactive amygdala. Increased physiological reactivity, as seen in sweating, is also associated with neuroticism. In one study, for example, 169 adults, mean age of 27, had their physiological responses measured as they watched a 60-minute TV program, House, Brumbaugh, Kothuri, Marcy, Seifert, and Pfaff, 2013. This TV episode was chosen because it included 4 separate 1-minute scenes that have been demonstrated to portray strong negative emotions: violence, fear, sadness, tension, and threat hostility. Page 457. Participants wore a vest that continuously measured heart rate, skin conductance, sweating, and respiration, breathing. They also completed a short 10-item measure of personality, Gosling et al., 2003. Inspired by Eysenck's theory, Brumbaugh and colleagues predicted that people high in neuroticism would have greater physiological response to each of the 4 negative emotion scenes. They found partial support for these predictions in that the violent fear scene produced greater galvanic skin conductance, sweating, in people high in neuroticism than those low in it. Heart rate and respiration differences, however, did not exist. Other research reported that greater skin conductance reactivity in people with high compared to low levels of neuroticism peaked at 4 to 5 seconds after the negative stimulus and did not return to normal for about 9 seconds. Norris, Larson, and Cacioppo, 2007. In those low in neuroticism, however, the peaks were small and occurred at about 2 seconds after the stimulus. And reactivity was back to normal by 3 to 4 seconds after the stimulus. So, the reactivity is both stronger and longer lasting in people high in neuroticism. In sum, the current research on the biology of neuroticism supports Eysenck's theoretical ideas going back to the 1960s, namely that the differences in limbic system and physiology would be the foundation for the personality trait of neuroticism. To be sure, there is more research to be done, and not all of the past research confirms each aspect of Eysenck's theory. But overall, a biological basis of neuroticism seems to be established. First, does Eysenck's biologically based theory generate research? On this criterion, it must be rated very high. Figure 14.6 shows the comprehensiveness of Eysenck's personality theory. The middle square embraces the psychometric properties of his theory, that is, psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. This figure also shows that Eysenck's personality theory is much more than a simple classification. The genetic and biological antecedents of behavior are suggested by the 2 squares on the left, whereas some of the consequences, or outcomes, of Eysenck's research are found in the 2 squares on the right. These consequences are a result of experimental studies on conditioning, sensitivity, vigilance, perception, memory, and reminiscence. Areas of research on social behavior are shown in the box on the far right and include such topics as sociability, criminality, creativity, psychopathology, and sexual behavior. Eysenck and his colleagues have reported significant amounts of research in these and other fields of research. Second, are trait and factor theories falsifiable? On this criterion, trait and factor theories receive a moderate to high rating. Some of Eysenck's research results, for example, his investigations of personality and disease, have not been replicated by outside researchers. His biological theory, because it makes specific predictions, is falsifiable. Results, however, are mixed, with some of his predictions being confirmed, e.g., optimal arousal, and some not, e.g., cognitive processing speed. Third, trait and factor theories are rated high on their ability to organize knowledge, because Eysenck's model of personality is one of the few to take biology seriously. It is one of the only theories that can explain the observations that individuals differ in behavior at birth, and that genetics accounts for roughly half of the variability in individual differences. Page 458. Fourth, a useful theory has the power to guide the actions of practitioners, and on this criterion, biological theories rank relatively low. Although these theories do a good job of explaining the origins of personality differences, they do not easily lend themselves to practical guides for teachers, parents, and even counselors. On this criterion, biological theory rates relatively low. Are trait and factor theories internally consistent? Again, the rating must be equivocal. The theory of Eysenck is a model of consistency, but when compared to the 5-factor model, Eysenck's model is somewhat inconsistent. Eysenck remained convinced that his giant 3 factors were superior to the big 5 model. This inconsistency presents a problem, especially because factor analysis is a precise mathematical procedure and because factor theories are heavily empirical. The final criterion of a useful theory is parsimony. Like McCrae and Costa's five-factor model, Eysenck's model of personality is also based on factor analysis and therefore provides a very parsimonious explanation of personality. Indeed, with only three major dimensions, Eysenck's model is even more parsimonious than the five-factor approach. On the determinism versus free choice dimension, Eysenck's theory sides somewhat toward the deterministic view, but only slightly. Biological foundations are difficult to change, but as the diathesis stress models make clear, both biology and environment are needed to create final personality qualities in an individual. Regarding optimism versus pessimism, Eysenck is mostly silent, but on teleology versus causality, he comes down on the side of causality. Recall the model in figure 14.614.6, where the chain of causality runs from DNA to limbic system to traits to proximal consequences, and finally to distal consequences. On the question of conscious versus unconscious determinants of behavior, Eysenck's approach leans toward unconscious determinants insofar as people are mostly incapable of being aware of how genetics and brain processes affect their behavior and personality. Regarding the issue of biological versus social influences, it may be somewhat surprising to say, but in fact, Eysenck very much argued for both nature and nurture. Biology may set the floor and ceiling of our behavior, but environment is needed to determine whether we will be closer to the floor or ceiling of our potential. On the dimension of individual differences versus similarities, biological theory leans quite a bit toward individual differences. Biological, brain, and genetic differences focus on the uniqueness of individuals. Eysenck, 1981, for example, wrote that people are above all individuals, PPCC. And yet at the same time, biological theory also demonstrates the commonality we all share as members of a single species. In that we are all members of the same species, we expect to see and do see commonality in personality structure the world over. Page 459. Eysenck used a hypothetico-deductive approach to extract three bipolar factors: extroversion/introversion, neuroticism/stability, and psychoticism/superego. Extroverts are characterized by sociability and impulsiveness, introverts by passivity and thoughtfulness. High scores on the neuroticism scale may indicate anxiety, hysteria, obsessive, compulsive disorders, or criminality. Low scores tend to predict emotional stability. High scores on psychoticism indicate hostility, self-centeredness, suspicion, nonconformity, and antisocial behavior. Low scores indicate a strong superego, empathy, and cooperation. Eysenck insisted that, to be useful, personality must predict behavior, and he presented ample evidence to support his three-factor theory. The three main dimensions of personality are biologically based as evidence from temperament, behavioral genetics, and brain research. Barbazange A, Piazza, PV, Lemoine M et Macquarrie S, 1996. Maternal